Welcome to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronymus. Laura Kortner is our executive producer and Anita Brockington our engineer. Most of us have heard the expression of top-down and bottom-up. Both suggest a hierarchy of direction. But the bottom-up process, being more lateral and all-encompassing of everyone, can be seen like the base of a pyramid, and while ascending takes in everyone. This does differ tremendously than the top-down, which issues directive, control, oligarchy from the very few at the top. Our guest this hour, Rob Kall, has written a wonderful book, The Bottom-Up Revolution, Mastering the Emerging World of Connectivity. His book encourages everyone in every domain of our lives to think more inclusively, interconnectedly, and therefore work from the bottom up in the sense of egalitarian principles and collaboration versus domination. But how do we, all of us who have mostly grown up in oligarchy, in power deriving from the top, in patriarchy specifically, further diminishing half the population out of hand for centuries, often stifling, if not outlawing, diversity and representation and voice. So how do we literally go about changing ourselves, the way we think and act, in order to arrive at a better way of living in community and community in the world? I hope you join us for this fascinating overview, which Rob Kall has built on hundreds of interviews from his broadcast career, from the boardroom to the schoolroom. Connectivity is the direction evolution pulls us towards. What it means and what it will look like is something Rob will help us explore this hour. Thanks for joining us, Rob.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I thought your book was fascinating and so useful both for individuals and groups. Why don't we start where you did, which is kind of like this introduction with the broad sweep of bottom up and top down.
Okay, well, I got into bottom up because I started a blog, a personal blog, and it started to take off with hundreds of thousands of visitors and thousands of articles and thousands of writers. And I discovered the more bottom up an approach to it, the better it did. Now, what does that mean? It means that the more I gave power to the users, gave power to the writers, the editors, the readers, the more I got them involved in making decisions about how things were done, the better it went. So I became fascinated with bottom up.
What time period did you start this?
So I started it like literally a couple weeks after Colin Powell told the UN that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And I just knew there weren't any. And I was outraged, and I had done some writing for other sites, and I had been a freelance writer, and I had made my living at it, which is not an easy thing to do. And as a freelance writer, you'd work with major national magazines, and you'd send them a proposal, and then they get back to you. It might take a month, but they'd get back to you. And what I found was that online, nobody got back to me. And I said, I can do this. I can not only do my own blog, but I can do one where I get back to people and treat them with respect, the same kind of respect that freelance writers get. So part of it was respect. I wanted
So that was in the 90s. You started this in the 90s?
No. 2000, no. It was 2003 when that happened.
Oh, okay.
This was the second.
I have a long memory of the 90s.
Yes. Well, no, there was a war in Iraq in the 90s too, but this was when George Bush went into Iraq, and so I became fascinated with it. I'm fascinated with blind spots, and I felt that this was one. So I started interviewing people, and I got lucky early on, and I interviewed people like Craig Newmark, the founder of Craigslist, and Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, Arianna Huffington, Bernie Sanders, Joseph Nye, who is the head of the Trilateral Commission, and ranked the number one expert on diplomacy in the United States. And all of these people gave me different aspects.
Yeah, broad variety you just mentioned, yeah.
And, even experts who have become fabulously successful at bottom up don't always get it. It's like fish in water. They don't know that they're in water. Or another example I like to give is, you've got the story of the blind wise ones, and they were told to figure out what was in the room that they were in. One said it was a tree trunk, another said it was a hose, another said it was a spear, another said it was a rope, another said it was a carpet, and they were all touching an elephant. And that's what we're dealing with now. So many people are experiencing different aspects of bottom up. The most common ones people think about are grassroots activism, wisdom of the crowd, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, comments on Yelp or Amazon. But it goes way back. I mean, this is the new technological emergence of bottom up, and it's huge, and it has catalyzed in this explosive bottom up revolution. But bottom up goes back before civilization, before technology existed. Humans existed for literally in different evolutional states, millions of years, about 7 million years, living mostly in hunter-gatherer bands, not even tribes, small bands, 30 to 80 people. And they lived unbelievably bottom-up lives. Now, what does that mean? It means that they took care of each other. It means that when they made decisions, they always thought about what their decision, the effect was going to be on all the other people in the band. They depended upon each other. They trusted each other. They cared about each other. These are all the most important bottom-up things about being human. And then civilization came along. Civilization was basically the introduction of the domestication of animals and land, the domination of animals or land. And agriculture has been described as war on biology, war on life itself. And, civilization is wonderful. We've had a belief that civilization was the way to be, and to not be civilized would be to be some kind of a brutish jungle creature. But the reality is there are still about 250 million indigenous people in the world today. And those people live pretty good lives. And what anthropologists have discovered is that the story that people who were outside of civilization led these brutish, struggling lives of desperation and violence is a total lie. It's all made up. It's part of the sales pitch for...
Yeah, it's the mind control of selling the latest. It's interesting that you write that the bottom-up connection consciousness is encoded in our DNA. I just love that way of articulating it. And you even go so far as to talk about bottom-up parenting and epigenetics. I think this is a very important point that very few people ever talk about. Can you talk with us a bit about that, what you mean?
Sure. Well, so... bottom up is in our genes. Probably the person who got me the furthest along on that understanding is a psychologist by the name of Darshan Narvaez. She's a professor at Notre Dame University, and she wrote a book, The Neurobiology of the Development of Human Morality. Now, that's a mouthful. And frankly, when I got my copy of the book, I didn't read it for a while because it just looked kind of daunting.
Right.
But when I picked it up, it was brilliantly written. Ends up, she won the William James Award for the best psychological book written in that year from the American Psychological Association, which is a very big honor. And the book basically documents how there are literally hundreds of genes that we have evolved to be a part of us that basically are all bottom-up genes. They're all genes that are designed to make us kind, to make us moral, to make us good parents. So what makes a good parent? Someone who takes care of a baby, who nurtures the baby, who makes the baby feel safe. The idea of letting a baby cry would be anathema to a band of people before civilization. They would all take care of that baby. And the thing is, we have these hundreds of genes, but civilization has repressed many of them. So we're not as connected to each other as we could be. We're not as empathic as we could be. We're not as caring as we could be. We're not as interdependent as we could be because the genes are repressed.
It's
And
so,
this is
and
what,
before you pass that point, I just think it's so fascinating because epigenetics,
yeah,
I mean, there's a whole field now that says even our traumas, come in the bloodline. And DNA, we know that now our genes can be turned on and off both by ourselves and at a distance, which is just fascinating. But I liked that you went far enough to say that authoritarian parenting damages our children.
yes, yes. Well, you've got to give children the room to grow and to have imagination and to fail, but also give them the confidence to believe in
Yeah,
themselves
as I say,
too.
safe boundaries so they don't hurt themselves. I was so glad you have so many things in your book, and I feel like I'm in a big hurry to try to get to all 50 questions. But I just want to point out a few things you have done that I think are so exceptional, Rob. I was so glad to see your inclusion of Helena Norberg Hodge and the book, because you and I have come to the same conclusion as she has, that this kind of globalization and this loss of ethos of care is really destroying the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Helena Norberg Hodge does a brilliant job in her movie Economics of Happiness. Uh, she's so on top of the whole story. It's a plague upon humanity, really. And the idea that both political parties really advocate for globalization, and we have to get to an understanding that globalization as it exists is awful for people. It's great for big corporations, transnational corporations, but for human beings, it's terrible.
I think
And
she did a funny study recently of the water that was exported from Australia to Europe was the exact same number of bottles they exported from Europe to Australia. And yet when you calculate the imprint, the carbon footprint, the gasoline, it's insane. I mean, literally, it is what Thomas Saz would say, we're in the land of the insane.
there's a lot of insanity going around. Or, Frank Zappa used to say hydrogen is not the most common element in the universe. Stupidity is.
I'd like to say people are so stupid it blows my mind. One of the other things you talk about is patterns, that when we're trying to change ourselves. So let's say everybody in the audience goes, yeah, let's all be more caring. Yeah, let's see, give it a try. Let's talk about some of the things that get in our way. Because you suggest there are 6 stages in the connection process.
Okay. Yes. So it's an interesting time. I believe that smartphones and the internet are catalyzing a return to bottom up, and they're catalyzing the activation of our epigenetic potentials. And you asked me to describe epigenetics. Let me just get into that very briefly.
Please.
I like to use the example of a seed from a redwood tree. If you take a seed from a redwood tree and you put it in a cup of dry sand, nothing happens. Add water and you get a stunted little plant because there are no nutrients. Put that seed into a deep forest and give it everything it needs, and you get a 300-foot tall tree that lasts hundreds of years. Same genetics, different epigenetics. We have to think about what we're doing to ourselves so that we can facilitate the reactivation of our bottom-up epigenetic potential. And a big challenge is connection. We have incredible potential for connecting with each other. And this goes back literally hundreds of millions of years. The first creatures that lactated, that breastfed, existed hundreds of millions of years ago. And that requires awareness of the infant's need to feed. That's empathy. So empathy is one of the oldest characteristics. And it's a deep, deep part of us. But we've lost so much of it, and it's repressed in so many. I did work in my earlier days working with positive psychology, and I got very interested in heartwarming and the feeling of a glow inside.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to understand it, and there wasn't much research about it, but there was some research on smiling. So I looked at a lot of research on smiling, and I found that happy people had stronger smile muscles, and depressed people had stronger frown muscles. But one piece that I discovered was that in Japan, where at some point, not so much now, I don't think, but there was a kind of a culture of hiding emotions. And what they found was that about 5% of the cadavers that they studied, their smile muscles had atrophied. Just imagine that. Muscles for smiling were so unused that they atrophied. And I think that it's an example of the potential that of loss that we could encounter in ourselves. But it also gives us the potential for how much more we can be, how much more we can become. And so I got with this interest in the heartwarming experience, those inner glows. I started looking and asking people about their heartwarming experiences, and I collected literally thousands of them. And I found that some people were telling me experiences that I didn't think were really heartwarming, but they were positive experiences. And I started kind of putting together an anatomy of positive experience. And I came up with this theory that positive experiences are the basic building blocks that go into our lives that give us the ability to be happy, to love, to trust, to be in caring relationships, to cope with adversity, and to face challenges and try new things.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big deal.
Well, it is a big deal, but we do have to take a break. Look, when we come back, we'll pick up there why empathy, as you point out, these positive experiences, give us happiness, love, trust, care, etc. If you're just joining us, Rob Kall is our guest. His last name is spelled Kall. You can learn more about his book, The Bottom-Up Revolution, Mastering the Emerging World of Connectivity. It's a Beaufort 2019 release, and you can learn more at www.opednews.com. That's opednews.com.
Hello, this is Helena Norberg Hodge of Local Futures. You can learn more about us at www.localfutures.org. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronymus.
There's our mutual friend, Helena Norberg Hodge at localfutures.org. Yes, she really, I think, has paved the way for every other researcher to understand what globalization is doing to the cultures around the world, and how it is. I mean, it's absurd that a nation grows enough food to feed itself, but they're forced to export it to other nations, and then they don't have enough food to feed their own people. I mean, this is craziness. If you're joining us, a gentleman who thinks he has a way out for all of us and looking at technologies and what they're enabling us to do, The Bottom-Up Revolution by Rob Kall. Rob is also a talk show host on Pacifica and Progressive Radio Network, and you can learn more at www.opednews.com. So coming back to this thing about happiness and love and trust and care, the patterns that we experience, you talk in the beginning of your book a bit about how we've been driven by this urge to get bigger, and this notion of getting bigger means success. And you point out, and that's what globalization basically is, that's its mantra, get bigger. But you point out, as have others, that we mimic this in our own lives in a very destructive way.
Absolutely. I believe that big is pathological. And the interesting thing is, I wrote this book as I'm a progressive, I'm a lefty, but conservatives have said, hey, bottom up is a conservative thing. I mean, and so it's given me hope that maybe the bottom up, top down conversation can be one that where we can find some common ground.
Uh-huh.
Conservatives don't like big government, but big corporations are, I believe, incredibly dangerous. People with the biggest money, billionaires, I've been writing since 2012 that we need to debillionaireize the planet. It's too dangerous for people to have that much money. Over the years, I've interviewed a good number of anthropologists, and I've asked them, what would an indigenous culture do with somebody who tried to control half the resources? And they have three answers. Treat them like they're insane, ban them, or kill them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying to do any of those things. We need to stop them from existing, and that can be done with legislation and laws. If you're going to be successful, great. Have a couple $100 million even. But if it gets close to $1 billion, you got to figure out ways to divest it, to get rid of it, to share it, to give it to other people. Because you know what? Nobody gets that rich on their own. Our culture, our society enables people to do that because of education, because of laws, because of legal systems. It's a collective process becoming successful. And this idea of individualism overall is I think kind of pathological too. We need to move towards a way of thinking that we all help each other and we all take care of each other. And I know that when I say that, there are a lot of conservatives who think that, that's socialist commie talking. It's not. It's the way nature is. Nature shows us that there are many different life forms that take care of each other.
Exactly.
And that is nature. That is the normal way things are. This individualist, I can take it all and I don't have to give anything back to anybody, is an incredibly selfish way that is just bad for humanity. It's bad for the planet, and it's killing the planet. I believe that we're in the middle of a biological holocaust. We are destroying so many life forms, and not just a big percentage of them. We're wiping them out. And this is horrific. And it's because of this value system, this I can have it all and I can have as much as I want, and it's good to have more and more and more. And this is part of a huge problem that we have. But, one other thing, by the way, the best way to find out about me is robkall.com, ROBKALL.com. Op-Ed News is my progressive political website, but if you want to find out about the book, robkall.com.
All right.
And I was talking about how to connect because, what's happened is our technology has disconnected a lot of people or changed people so that they have very, very shallow connections. At the same time, we've moved, I believe, to a connection economy. If you look at the biggest companies that are existing now, they're made because of their ability to tap and understand how people are connected to each other and to our culture. You look at Amazon and Google and Facebook, they're all about connection. And they're making billions and hundreds of billions of dollars doing it. But people need to work harder to connect more effectively. So I was talking before the break about how positive experiences are at the core of our ability to be happy and to have relationships. And so what I did was I came up with a model, what I call an anatomy of positive experience, that I think can help people to have more, better, deeper, stronger positive experiences and more, better, deeper connection experiences. So I can walk you through that if you'd like me to.
Sure. Well, I think everybody in our listening audience, experiences the world from their own lens and from their own heart. And everybody knows the difference between feeling connected and caring versus feeling excluded or not caring. And the way the animals put it to me is that humanity lost our ethos of care, and that the ethos of care still in the indigenous culture centers around the mother and the child, and that it's not a matriarchy in the sense of politics. It's a matriarchy in terms of care. And so I think you put your finger right on the pulse of what so many elders speak to around the world of this gentle transition from a heart of me first to a heart of all of us together is it might sound like such a minimal little shift, but it's profoundly different.
Absolutely. And it is so much richer for people to be in that way. They give up so much when they go to the me first way. They lose so much because we have these hundreds of genes that are designed for us to be connected to other people, designed for us to care about other people and to see a world through eyes that routinely think about other people and the considerations for them. You know, the Native Americans have the seven generations
Sure.
rule. They make a decision based on how it'll affect the next 7 generations. And we really need to get back to that. There is so much that we need to relearn from indigenous peoples that we lost as we became Westerners. The Western culture, it's got a lot of problems.
Well, it was born out of domination, so if you just start there, we're at the root. We're at the root, the taproot, if you will, of destruction. So you had mentioned, though, there's so many things you talk about in your book. It's just a fascinating read because you've interviewed so many thousands of interesting people. I thought one of the things that you talked about, and I just want to jump ahead if you don't mind because we're going to run out of time. I think you and I could talk about 4 hours together pretty easily. Dealt with about Twitter. And I want to jump to this rather than how to feel connected. We can come back to that. Because the technology is, a two-faced sword. It can be wonderful for bringing us together. It also, when we see in younger generations, children killing themselves because somebody doesn't like their photo or doesn't include them in their rounds. Talk to us a bit about this, the technology and how it has positives and also potentially negative impacts.
I think, Twitter is not as guilty as Facebook
Right.
or Instagram,
Right.
which is owned by Facebook, by the way. I think Twitter is an ecosystem more of information and news, whereas Facebook and Instagram is where people show off all their fun stuff, all their happy stuff, and I think that it shows the people viewing it a very selected view of the world, and so there are a lot of people who get depressed by seeing it. And I think that it's really important that they understand that. And I really believe that you have to get analog. Analog means direct connection without digital. You have to do that on a regular basis. There are even studies coming out now. You need to spend a certain number of hours per week in nature. And that is so important. It used to be, 50, 60 years ago, there wasn't hardly anybody had air conditioning. Hardly anybody had color TVs. So what did people do? They sat outside and they sat with their neighbors and they talked to them face to face. Air conditioning came along, they went inside. TV came along, they stayed inside. And those connections to neighbors disappeared. It is so important that you rebuild connections to people and have contact with them on a regular basis. More and more people are working at home. I work at home. I work at a home office. But you have to make time to connect with other people.
Yeah.
You have to make time to be in nature. The Native Americans, they talk to trees. They talk to nature. And now we know that trees talk to each other. They literally have pheromones. They have underground root systems that connect. It's amazing how much nature is connected. In Avatar, James Cameron described a world where all the living beings were connected in an incredible biological web. Well, that's what we have here too. But you can ignore it. And it's at your risk. It's so important that you spend time, and this is simple stuff. Now, another piece of bottom-up is I really believe that there's a kind of a bottom-up power, and there's bottom-up intelligence. The thing is, bottom-up power is a different kind of power than the old power that existed in the old history books. Old history, top-down history, was about generals and kings and emperors. Bottom-up history is about the people. It's about workers. It's about farmers. It's about different groups. And what you can learn from all that is that you have power. What's wonderful about this a shift that's happening where more and more the history that's being taught is bottom-up history. History of blacks, of women, of workers, of local communities. When you look at bottom-up history, the people have the power. There's a collective power that anybody can access. And that changes everything. If you teach kids only top-down history, then they think that generals and kings have power. If you teach them about how the average person made changes happen, then they all believe that they can have power, they can have agency, and they can make a difference in the world. But the power is different. Nations and kings and the most wealthy, they have what's called hard power. Hard power is money and weapons and force. The new power that everybody has access to, the kid who's 13 years old who starts a YouTube channel with millions of followers, that's soft power. Soft power is about attraction. And attraction is incredibly powerful. In Iraq, they couldn't win with soldiers and weapons. They started succeeding when they started building schools and clinics and helping out the people. That's soft power. And that is something that bottom up is all about. When you open yourself up to connection, when you open yourself up to nature, when you take time to think about other people more, then you are activating your bottom-up epigenetic potential.
Well, in the esoteric traditions, all of them, doesn't matter, and in the indigenous traditions, it's all about service. If they ask, and what is the purpose of being a human? To be of service. And we're speaking it in a different language, but from the esoteric vantage point, that's always been what has been taught as the power that resides within human is as a co-creator, and as a co-creator, you're being of service. We'll be right back. Our guest is Rob Kall. His book is fascinating. I encourage you to read it. It's really a beautiful synthesization of hundreds and hundreds of interviews with fascinating people. Rob Kall, The Bottom Up Revolution. You can learn more at his website, robkall, KALL.com.
Hello, this is Pete Lyden, the founder of reInvent. You can find us at reinvent.net. We're a group that pulls together top innovators across America, even across the world, to really work on solving complex challenges and actually reinventing our world. And today you are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronymus.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. The first caller at 1-800-922-6680. That's WCBM 680 will be a winner. We're having a funny little feedback, at least in my headset. Be a winner of our guest book, The Bottom Up Revolution, Mastering the Emerging World of Connectivity. If you know the author's name, you will be a winner of his book. All right, so coming back to this whole notion of bottom up versus top down, you also talk so much about the importance of story. And I love that you included the solar journey, the hero's mythology of Joseph Campbell. It was just wonderful, all the things you've included.
Well, I believe that story is a part of our evolutionary heritage as well. I think we evolved to tell stories around the campfire, and we define ourselves by our stories. We define our relationship to our culture by our stories, and we need to change our stories. The civilization story, the Western culture story, is one of domination and individualism, and we need to shift the stories. Now, the hero's journey, as it's portrayed in popular movies, is about some super person who saves everybody else. And I really believe that what we need to do is need to start telling stories about how the collective we save ourselves. And there have been a few stories like that. But we need to have writers like James Cameron and Shonda Rhimes, who are just generating all this incredible, powerful story content. We need to get them to start telling stories where the heroes are the people.
Exactly. Well, and there is such a difference. People often think of individualism as the same thing as individuation, and they're not. I mean, the Western path of individuation is where a person becomes whole and is a server of their society and community. Individualism, as purported by the Western path, is I do what I have to do, for me, I take all. And so it's not that to be an individual or to individuate is a problem. It's the intention that you do with your self-discovery.
Exactly. And the individualism is tied in with narcissism and authoritarianism often. Narcissism has become a huge problem that
Enormous.
I don't think that before civilization would have been tolerated. And now it's rewarded.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some corporations that literally look for psychopaths.
Well, we have a president who's a psychopath. I mean, in my opinion, a malignant narcissist. I don't know any other better category to put him in.
I'm with you. Yes.
But Bill McKibben, on the other side of the coin, let's talk about the change because, it is true that chaos, which is pretty much how you could describe our political state today, has an opportunity to birth great new order in a very positive fashion. And that's the way I prefer to come down on this chaos that we're in.
Well, and I write about that chaos theory, but basically there was a Nobel Prize given for proving that out of chaos can come higher levels of order.
Right.
And I learned that probably 30, 35 years ago, and it's been comforting to me ever since. If you're facing chaos, well, that may just mean that there's a great opportunity for something better to happen.
Exactly. And as you also point out, I think it was Peggy Holman, another person you interviewed, who talked about, all change is a process of emergence. And I loved the line you included from her, engaging emergency, turning upheaval into opportunity.
Yes. Emergence is such a neat concept. The top-down nature of science is linear, analytical. You take things apart like a machine. The bottom-up approach to science is systemic, and you basically look at patterns and relationships and connections. And when you look that way at the world, you're looking at the world with very different eyes. Mm-hmm. And emergence is an important part of systems theory because with the cycles, the nonlinear nature of the way of thinking of things, cycles can shift, and you can have new developments that happen very quickly. And what I love about systems theory is it doesn't have to be some preponderance of things happening. It can just pop up out of the blue and explode into reality very quickly. Mm-hmm. And that gives me hope. Yeah. It gives me a lot of hope that things may be bad now, but somebody may come along and come up with a good idea, and then more people may do it. And literally in days or weeks, the world can change.
And that's true. And not just even with our physical bodies, but our subtle bodies, with our positive thoughts, prayers, intentions, meditations. We have a lot of power we don't actually let use as a mass of humans, but I believe we will in my lifetime. Bill McKibben is a good example of 350.org. He's another one you profiled, like hundreds of others. And you talked to him about 5,200 acts of protests that went on in 181 countries with 117 nations supporting the effort to address global warming. I mean, here's an example of where this interconnectedness that the internet facilitates makes it possible for those with good intentions to join up with others of good intention globally.
And the thing is, when you start seeing with bottom-up eyes, you start seeing those possibilities.
Right.
And when I talked to Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was the policy director for the State Department under Hillary Clinton, she said that when people start using these kinds of approaches and connecting in these kinds of ways, they start seeing possibilities and opportunities where they didn't before. That's my hope for this book, that this book will open people's bottom-up eyes so they'll start seeing possibilities and opportunities. Start seeing bottom-up ways instead of top-down ways, connecting ways instead of separating ways. And I think that, both Woody Guthrie and Howard Zinn both said that it's going to take millions of little things to save the world. And I think it's this kind of way of seeing that can really make the difference. We need a new story, and we need a new way of seeing, a new way of filtering our world. And I think that everybody can do it. And my hope is by just listening to this conversation, maybe reading more of the book. I mean, the book offers hundreds of different, very specific examples of how this can be done, whether it's in your personal life, in your community, in your religious experience, in economics, in activism, in politics, in connecting. There are so many ways that this touches us because we have hundreds of genes that are tied in with this, and it's become the nature of our economic system. It's a connection system now.
When you look at the changing of the media ecosystem, and you and I have both been in the media for much of our professional lives. When I was a daily broadcaster for a decade, I started when there was no internet. So I would go out 4 a.m, get the articles, get the papers, get the magazines, the journals, cover with ink. And it was a very slow process, which allowed me a certain depth I was a whistleblower, so I did all my own primary research. And I found that once things came online, it was much harder actually to get really good information because there was so much noise. And I now see it in young people who I work with, that they have so much trouble discerning what information is true and what is just fabricated or not true at all.
Well, that's a part of the skills that need to be built, is learning how to separate the wheat from the chaff, really. The digital wheat from chaff. I mean, yes, certainly.
But there are other things that you talked about. I just want to come back to Twitter. I've never tweeted in my life, so I know nothing about the technology other than I used to kind of make fun at people who I thought so much of running around going, oh, I should tweet that I'm running here. And I'm thinking, who cares? But there was this one thing you wrote about some guy who has mastered how to use Twitter, like our president uses it. And it had to do with hashtagging is the key to have people follow you. And he had a computer that did it for him. He said, you have to tweet 100 times a day, and he had a computer to do it for him, in order to get the kind of following that you want. That blows my mind, I have to tell you.
Well, it's automated. There are applications that enable you to plug in a number of tweets, and then it multiplies them and sends them out for you. And, if you think about it, the way Twitter works, people check in on Twitter X number of times a day. I might check in 2 or 3 times a day. That's a really low number compared to other people. But so if I check in and I'm looking at it for 5 or 10 minutes, 2 or 3 times a day, I'm only going to see the stream at that time.
Right.
So if somebody's tweeting the same thing 20 times and they've got 5 tweets they're tweeting 20 times, that's 100 tweets. I still might not see them. So that's basically the thinking behind it. But Twitter is a tool that is not just about sending out tweets and hoping people will see them. Hashtags, if you add hashtags to your tweets, then a lot more people will see them than just your followers. You can only have 50 followers.
Well, that was the key, was the hashtagging. You take trending subjects and hashtag your line. Anyway, let's close on a positive note of how each of us, whether we're using social media or we're having a meeting or we're going to the grocery store, can practice bottom up.
Well, the most basic thing is to just reach out and touch people and be in face-to-face contact with them. Smell their breath. Go out into nature. touch a tree, talk to a tree, look at the sky. Just be present in the real world and get out of the digital world.
Mm-hmm.
The digital world offers plenty of opportunity, and my book describes in great detail how to take advantage of it in new ways, in bottom-up ways. But if you want to be happy, you need to connect with other people and with nature.
And I'd also like to add, Rob, to it is to work locally. You know, that is where everybody's power resides, and that's where all of us can make the most influence to build the kind of world we really want to see. You can think globally, but act locally. Well, your book is a pleasure. I don't feel I did justice to it. The Bottom Up Revolution by Rob Kall. You can find him online at www.robkall.com, Kall.com. You can also find him on the airwaves out there on Pacifica and the Progressive Radio Networks. And thank you so much, Rob, for all the work you do in bringing hope and humor as well to your audiences.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
You're welcome, Rob. Thank you so much. Rob Kall.
I hope we can all live fearlessly and we can
stay connected with stimulating talk and breaking news on Talk Radio 680 WCBM, Baltimore, and WCBM.com.